He hadn't touched a champagne glass in 2 years, hadn't smiled, hadn't forgiven himself for surviving her. But tonight, in the most expensive restaurant in Chicago, Dante Valen, the man who made grown men beg for death, froze completely still. Not because of the gun tucked beneath his jacket, not because of the 11 bodyguards stationed around the dining room, because of a necklace. Her necklace, around the throat of a 24-year-old waitress who had no idea she was 30 seconds away from dying. Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Chicago does not sleep. It just changes its face after midnight, pulls the suits off, lets the ugliness breathe. The lake wind cuts between the towers like something personal, like the city has a grudge against warmth, against softness, against anything that dares to feel too much. Dante Valen knew that wind better than most. He'd grown up in it. He'd built an empire in it. And for the past 2 years, he'd been buried in it without actually dying, which he sometimes thought was the cruelest joke the universe had ever told. He rode in the back of the black Escalade without speaking. Gideon Cross sat to his left. Big man, quiet man. The kind of quiet that came from having seen too much and decided that words were mostly useless. The driver, Marco, kept his eyes forward. No one played music. No one asked where they were going. They already knew. They always knew every October 14th. The Eclipse Room, private table, 1 bottle of champagne that Dante would order and not drink. 2 hours of sitting alone in a crowd of people too rich and too stupid to recognize they were dining next to the most dangerous man in the city. It was not grief exactly. Dante had stopped calling it grief somewhere around month 4. Grief implied softness, implied tears, implied some eventual path through to the other side. What Dante carried was different, heavier. It had calcified inside his chest into something structural, something he'd built himself around the way a tree grows around a piece of wire. Not healing, just continuing, just existing around the thing that had broken him. Serena. He didn't let himself think her name until he was sitting at that table every year. That was the deal he'd made with himself. 364 days of iron control. 1 night of sitting in the place she'd loved, ordering the champagne she would have drunk, staring at the empty chair across from him. Then he put her back in the box, and he went on being what Chicago needed him to be. He adjusted his cufflink. Italian silk, platinum fastening. Serena had bought them for him on their 3rd anniversary. He wore them every October 14th for the same reason he ordered the champagne. Because the alternative was forgetting, and forgetting felt like a second death he wasn't willing to participate in. The Escalade pulled to the curb outside the Eclipse Room. Gideon moved first, always moved first, scanning the street with the flat professionalism of a man who calculated threat levels the same way other people calculated tips. He opened the door. Dante stepped out into the October cold and felt the wind hit his face like a hand. The restaurant was everything money could buy and taste could arrange. 40 feet of glass on the street level. Warm amber light bleeding through onto the sidewalk. The kind of establishment where the menu had no prices because if you were asking, the reservation list had already rejected you. Dante had eaten here 17 times with Serena. He could still remember which table she'd preferred, corner booth, left wall, where she could watch the room without being watched back. She had always been like that. Alert. Private. Reading things that other people never thought to look for. He should have paid more attention to what she was reading. Lucien Graves was already inside. Of course he was. Lucien was always already inside everything. That was his particular gift, or what Dante had spent 23 years believing was a gift. The man could walk into any room in Chicago and make it feel like he owned it slightly more than whoever had actually bought it. He was 61, silver-haired, dressed in charcoal cashmere that probably cost more than most people's car payments. He stood when Dante entered, extending a hand with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent his entire adult life manufacturing loyalty from the raw material of deception. Dante. The handshake was firm. The smile reached his eyes, which Dante had always interpreted as sincerity. He understood now, looking back, that some people simply had no tells. Not because they weren't lying, because they'd been lying for so long that it had become the baseline. You look tired. I'm always tired in October, Dante said. I know. Lucien gestured to the table. I ordered the Krug. They had a 97. You thought correctly. Dante sat down, settled his jacket, looked at the empty chair across from him the way a man looks at an open wound he's been ignoring long enough that he's almost used to the throb of it. "Thank you for coming. I'm always here." Lucien sat beside him rather than across. A small thing, but an intentional one, Dante understood in retrospect. Always beside, never across, never in the position where Dante might look at him directly for too long. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." "I know." "She wouldn't want—" "Don't!" The word came out flat. Quiet. The restaurant noise continued around them. Silverware on china, low voices, a piano somewhere doing something French and melancholy. But at their table, everything stopped. Lucien stopped. He had enough instinct left to recognize the edge in that single syllable. "Not tonight." Lucien nodded, lifted his champagne glass, said nothing more on the subject, and that was the night. That was how it went. Every October 14th, two men at a table, one of them pretending to mourn, the other one actually doing it. Noelle Avery was 17 minutes late, and her left shoe was starting to blister, and she had not eaten anything since a granola bar at noon, and she was already calculating in her head how much she'd need to make in tips tonight to cover the minimum payment on her father's medical bill, which was due on the 16th and which represented approximately 1/3 of what she actually owed, which was itself approximately 1/30th of the total balance, which her brain refused to process in its entirety. Because if she did, she would sit down on the sidewalk outside the Eclipse room and simply not get back up. She didn't sit down. She went around to the service entrance, swiped her badge, changed out of her coat in the break room with her fingers still half numb, and was tying her apron when Carla, the senior floor manager, caught her arm. "You're on Valen's section tonight." Noelle blinked. "What?" Alvarez called out, "You're the only one with enough floor experience for that table." "Carla, I've been here 4 months." "I know. That's why I'm not giving it to someone who's been here 4 weeks. Carla looked at her the way women who'd been managing restaurant floors for 20 years looked at everything, with a kind of compressed, efficient compassion that had no room for extended sympathy. "Table 8, private section, north wall. The man doesn't want conversation, he wants invisible service. Don't make eye contact longer than necessary. Don't hover. Don't ask if everything's okay. If a glass is below half, refill it. That's the entire job." "Who is he?" Carla paused, and that pause told Noelle everything she needed to know before the words arrived. "Dante Valen. You know who that is?" "I know the name." "Then you know what I mean when I say that invisible service is not a preference tonight. It's a survival strategy." Carla released her arm. "You'll be fine. Just don't make it weird." Noelle did not have time to process the specific calibration of fear that information produced because the floor was already moving, the dinner rush compressing into its peak hour, and she had 4 other tables before she got anywhere near table 8. She served them on autopilot. Rigatoni for the couple celebrating something, Dover sole for the man who kept looking at his phone. She refilled the bread basket 3 times and smiled at all the right moments, and none of it registered because her body was running the mechanics of the job while her mind was doing what it always did on October 14th, remembering the woman from the diner. 2 years ago exactly. She'd been working the overnight at a roadside place outside the city, a job she'd taken when the hospital bills first started arriving, when she was still naive enough to believe that working enough hours would eventually solve a problem that math itself couldn't solve. 3 a.m. on a Wednesday. Rain coming down so hard the windows looked like they were sweating. She'd been refilling the coffee carafes when the door opened. The woman who walked in didn't look like someone who should have been anywhere near that diner. She was dressed for somewhere important. Silk blouse, good jewelry, the kind of shoes that cost what Noelle made in a month. But the silk was soaked through and torn at the shoulder, and the shoes had left a trail of wet blood across the linoleum from the door to the nearest booth. And the woman's face had the specific blankness of someone operating on the last reserves of a system that was shutting down. Noelle had grabbed the first aid kit before she'd consciously decided to move. Had locked the front door? There were no other customers, hadn't been since midnight, and slid into the booth across from the woman and said, with the particular directness of someone too tired to waste time on protocol, "I need to see it." The woman had looked at her. Dark eyes, clear despite everything, still reading the room even then, still calculating. I need you to not call anyone. Show me the wound first. Then we can negotiate. It was in her side. Below the ribs, entry and no exit, which meant the bullet was still in there, which meant Noelle was already out of her depth in ways that should have made her reach for the phone regardless of what the woman wanted. But the woman had grabbed her wrist before she could move. Not hard. She didn't have the strength left for hard. Just enough. Just the pressure of a hand that was used to asking for things and getting them. Please. A single word. The only time in the hours that followed that the woman used that word. There are men. The police. Some of them. They're already looking for me. If you call it in, I'm dead before morning. Noelle had made the worst and most right decision of her life in approximately 4 seconds. She'd gotten towels. She'd done what she could, which was not enough. She had known from the start it was not enough. But it had bought time. An hour, maybe a little more. Time enough for the woman to talk. Her name was Serena Vallon. Noelle hadn't known that name then, not the weight it carried, not the empire it was attached to. She'd just been a woman in a booth, bleeding out slowly, talking in a voice that stayed steady through sheer discipline while everything else about her body was failing. My husband. He doesn't know, Serena said. He can't know yet. Not through the right channels. Someone inside has already gotten to the right channels. She had gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles had gone white. There's a ledger. In my coat. Inside pocket. I need you to take it. The ledger was small. Leather, dark brown, water-stained at the corners. Noelle had pulled it out and held it and felt, in some inarticulate way, the specific gravity of something that was going to change her life. And the necklace. Serena had lifted her hand to the clasp at her throat. Slowly, the movement costing her more than it should have. The pendant was sapphire, deep blue, set in a platinum frame that was clearly custom, clearly significant. He'll know it. He gave it to me on our wedding day. He has never seen it on anyone else's throat. Her fingers had fumbled with the clasp, and Noelle had reached over and undone it for her. And in the doing of it, their hands had met and held for a moment that Noelle still couldn't fully articulate. Every October 14th, he goes to the eclipse room. He never misses it. Wear the necklace. Bring the ledger. He'll find you. Why don't I just... Because I need him to hear it in person, from someone who was there, not a letter, not a recording. Someone who held my hand. Serena had looked at her with those dark, clear eyes that were going dim at the edges. Can you do that? Can you wait 2 years and do that? 2 years. It had seemed incomprehensible. It had also seemed like the only possible answer. Yes, Noelle had said. Serena had closed her eyes, had breathed through whatever was happening inside her for a long moment. And then she had said very quietly, Tell him I tried to come back. Tell him that part first. She died 20 minutes later. Noelle snapped back to the floor. Table 11 needed their check. Table 6 wanted more sparkling water. She moved through it all with the muscle memory of someone who had learned to function around an enormous and unmovable weight. And then it was time, and she picked up the champagne service tray and walked toward the north wall. She had almost not worn the necklace tonight. That was the part that would haunt her later. How close it had come to not happening at all. She'd tucked it under her collar on the walk over, thinking she could keep it hidden, thinking she would find a moment to approach the man carefully, privately, rather than just appearing at his table with the dead wife's jewelry visible around her throat. She'd meant to be strategic. She'd meant to be careful. The blisters had distracted her, and the granola bar wearing off had distracted her. And thinking about the minimum payment due on the 16th had distracted her. So she was not thinking about the necklace when she approached table 8. She was thinking about the angle of the pour, the position of the glasses, the absolute necessity of not making this weird. And she leaned forward to fill the primary glass, and the pendant slipped free from her collar and swung forward into the warm light of the table's candle. The sapphire caught the light and held it, and Dante Vallon stopped being a human being for approximately 3 seconds. She felt it before she saw it, the change in the pressure of the room at that table, something atmospheric, the way a temperature drop registers before your brain has consciously processed it. She straightened and she looked and she saw a face that had gone absolutely white beneath its composure, a jaw that had locked, 2 hands that had dropped to the tablecloth and gone still with the specific stillness of something being held in place by tremendous effort. His eyes were on the necklace, not on her. just on the necklace. And in his eyes was something she had not expected from a man who looked like this, dressed like this, occupied a room like this. Something raw and cracked open and entirely human. Then the moment broke. He moved faster than a man his size had any right to move. The chair scraped back. His hand came across the table and closed around the front of her collar. Not the necklace, but the fabric just above it. And she was pulled forward until she could count the lines at the corners of his eyes, and the only thought her brain produced was a single clinical observation. He's been crying. Recently. Before he came in here, he was crying in the car. The champagne glass shattered on the floor. The room went silent. 11 bodyguards turned toward table 8. That necklace, Dante Valen said, and his voice was something she had never heard from another human being. Not anger, not grief, but the two of them fused into something that had no good name, belonged to my wife. The entire restaurant held its breath. Noelle Avery was 24 years old, and she was carrying 2 years of a dead woman's secret, and she owed more money than she would earn in the next decade, and her left shoe was still blistering, and she had never been more afraid in her life. She looked him directly in the eye. "I know," she said. And then, before the fear could win, before the calcified thing in his chest could turn into action, "Your wife never died in that car crash." The hand on her collar did not loosen, but it didn't tighten either. And Lucy Graves, 3 feet away, reached for his water glass with fingers that had gone, very quietly, the color of old ash. The hand on her collar did not move. Neither did anything else in that room. Not the sommelier frozen mid-step near the service station. Not the couple at table 9 who had been mid-laugh about something that no longer existed. Not the piano, which had stopped. The pianist had simply lifted his hands from the keys the moment the champagne glass shattered. Some animal instinct telling him that whatever was happening at table 8 was not background noise. Dante Valen had not moved either. Just stood there with his fist wrapped in the fabric of a waitress's collar, 6 feet of controlled violence suspended in the specific stillness of a man whose entire operating system had just crashed and was in the process of rebooting into something none of the people in this room were going to enjoy. Noelle could feel his knuckles against her collarbone, could feel the heat coming off him, which surprised her. She'd expected cold, expected the reptile stillness of a man who'd ordered enough deaths to stop running warm, but he was burning. Whatever was happening inside him was generating actual heat. "Say that again," he said. His voice was very quiet. That was the part that made Gideon Cross, standing 8 feet to the left, shift his weight forward by exactly 1 inch. Loud was manageable. Loud meant pressure that needed release. Quiet like this meant something had already been decided and was simply being confirmed. "Your wife didn't die in a car accident," Noelle said. Her voice only cracked on the last word, which she considered a significant personal achievement. "She was shot. She survived the crash, or whatever they told you happened. She was shot, and she walked into the diner where I worked, and she died in a booth in my arms at 4:17 in the morning, and the last thing she asked me to do was find you and tell you the truth." The silence after that was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. Dante's grip did not change. His eyes moved from the necklace to her face, and what she saw in them was not what she'd braced for. Not rage, not the flat calculation of someone deciding how to dispose of a problem. It was something that looked horrifyingly like hope. Like a man who had been living inside a locked room for 2 years and had just heard someone knock from the outside. That was almost worse than the rage would have been. "You're lying," Lucy Graves said. The words came from Dante's right, and they came too fast. That was the tell. Not the content, but the speed. A man who is genuinely skeptical takes a breath first. A man who is genuinely unconcerned lets a beat pass. Lucy Graves had the words out before Noelle had fully finished her sentence, and Dante registered it the same way she did. She could see it in the way his jaw shifted, a micro-movement, a recalibration happening somewhere behind his eyes. He let go of her collar. She didn't step back. She didn't know why. Some instinct told her that stepping back was the wrong move, that it would read as guilt, when what she needed to project was the specific texture of someone who had been carrying something heavy for 2 years and was finally setting it down. "Where?" Dante said. Just the one word. "A diner. Route 41, about 40 minutes outside the city. I was working the overnight. She came in around 3 a.m. She was... Noelle stopped, reorganized, kept her voice level by main force of will. She was dressed well. Wrong place for it. She had a wound in her side below her ribs. She wouldn't let me call anyone. She said the police were already compromised. Something moved through Dante's face at that. A wave of something that he controlled immediately, shutting it down the way you shut a door on a fire. Fast, hard, necessary. She was shot, he said. Yes. Not the crash. There might have been a crash. I don't know what happened before she walked in, but the injury wasn't from impact. I've seen enough bar fights and kitchen accidents to know the difference between a puncture wound and blunt trauma. She held his gaze. Her hands were shaking at her sides, and she was fairly certain he could see that, but there was nothing to be done about it. She lasted about an hour and a half. She talked the whole time. "This is theater," Lucien said. His voice had dropped its warmth. Something harder had come through, the way infrastructure becomes visible when the decorative layer starts to peel. "Someone found out about the anniversary. Someone who knew your habits, Dante. This is a setup." "For what?" Dante said. He didn't look at Lucien when he said it. He was still looking at Noelle. "To destabilize you. To introduce doubt. To... Lucien!" Still quiet. Still not looking at him. "Stop talking." A beat. 2. "The necklace," Dante said. "Tell me how you got the necklace." So Noelle told him. She told him everything in the order it happened, the way you reconstruct something you've been rehearsing in your head for 2 years. Not smoothly, not with the flow of a prepared speech, but with the specific texture of real memory, which doubles back on itself, which gets the small details right and loses the larger shape sometimes. She told him about unlocking the front door of the diner, about the blood on the linoleum, about the way Serena's hands had been shaking when she'd tried to undo the clasp herself. She told him about the ledger. At the word ledger, Lucien Graves picked up his water glass and set it down again without drinking from it. Dante said, "You have it." "Yes." "With you, tonight." She told me to bring both, the necklace and the ledger. She said... Noelle paused, and this pause was different, softer, the pause of someone handling something fragile. "She said you'd always come here on October 14th. She said you'd always come back." Dante turned away from her, turned to face the window, hands at his sides, looking out at the Chicago night, like it owed him something. The restaurant held its collective breath. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The sommelier had taken 3 slow, silent steps backward until he was pressed against the wall near the service corridor. Gideon Cross watched Lucien Graves the way a man watches a dog that's decided whether to bite. 30 seconds passed. 40. Dante turned back around. His face had restructured itself into something controlled, something that functioned, but underneath it, just barely underneath it, was the open wound of a man who had been told the story he'd built his survival on was a lie. "The ledger," he said to Noelle. "Where is it?" "My locker. In the break room." He looked at Gideon. That was all, just a look. Gideon was already moving toward the service corridor before the look finished. Lucien stood up. "Dante, I need you to think about what you're doing. Someone walks in off the floor with a piece of jewelry and a story, and you're going to..." "Sit down, Lucien. I'm trying to protect..." "Sit." The word landed like something physical. "Down." Lucien sat. The table was very quiet for the 45 seconds it took Gideon to return from the break room with a small, dark brown, water-stained leather book held in one large hand, like he wasn't sure if it was evidence or a weapon or both. He set it on the table in front of Dante. Dante looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then he pulled out the chair. Not his chair. Not the chair he'd been sitting in, but the empty chair, the one across from where he sat every October 14th and stared at for 2 hours every year, and sat down in it, as if by changing position he could change what was about to happen to him. He opened the ledger. The handwriting was Serena's. He would have known it in his sleep, in his grave, at the end of whatever came after everything. Small, precise, slightly left-leaning, the way she'd written grocery lists and birthday cards and the note she'd left on his pillow the morning of their 5th anniversary. He turned the pages slowly. 1, then 2, then 3. His face showed nothing. His hands were very still on the paper. Then something changed in the quality of his stillness. Noel watched it happen. Couldn't have named it exactly. It was less an expression than a shift in density, the way a person becomes heavier when something lands that can't be unlanded. He stopped turning pages. He stared at one specific page for a long time. Then he looked up. Not at Noel, at Lucien. Lucien held his gaze. And in that 2 seconds of eye contact, the entire history of their 23-year relationship, every deal closed, every loyalty sworn, every dinner like this one where the warmth had felt real, processed itself in Dante's face and came out the other side as something very cold and very still. Lucien, he said, whatever's in there is fabricated. The Harmon account. Dante's voice was conversational. Easy. The easiness of it was catastrophic. Tell me about the Harmon account. A half-second hesitation. Barely visible. Barely. Legitimate operating expenses, properly $3.2 million, routed through a shell in the Caymans to a holding company you personally registered in 2021. Dante had not looked back down at the ledger. He was reading from memory, or from something he'd been told, or from the specific register of Lucien's micro-expression, or from all three at once. The holding company contracted with Orlov's people. Your competitor. Your enemy, Lucien. You financed the organization we've been at war with for 6 years. The restaurant was so quiet that when someone at table 4 quietly set down their fork, everyone heard it. Lucien's face went through several things in rapid succession. Noel watched it the way you watch a building go through the stages of a controlled demolition. The initial integrity holding, then the structural cracks, then the thing that was always going to happen finally happening. He reached into his jacket. Gideon Cross was faster. He had Lucien's wrist before the hand made it past the lapel. Not dramatic, no shouting, no flourish. Just the simple mechanical efficiency of a very large man who had spent 30 years being faster than the people who thought they were fast. He twisted, and the sound Lucien's wrist made caused 2 people at nearby tables to stand up. And within 3 seconds, Lucien Graves was standing with both arms locked behind him and his face pressed against the economics of whether to make this worse. He made it worse. You want to burn this down? His voice had changed completely now. The cashmere warmth was gone, and what was underneath it was not the panic of a cornered man, but something harder, something that had been sitting under the performance for decades, waiting. You think I'm the only one? You think I built this alone? There are people. Stop, Dante said. People who will come for you regardless of what you do to me tonight. You're already... I said stop. She should have told you when she had the chance. Lucien's eyes moved to Noel. Something in them that was not quite hatred, but was close enough that the distinction didn't matter much. Instead, she sent a waitress, with a children's book. And you're going to burn 23 years of... Dante stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward Lucien. He just stood up from the dead woman's chair and straightened his jacket and looked at the man who had been the closest thing to a brother he'd had for most of his adult life, with the expression of someone who has finished a calculation and doesn't like the answer but accepts it completely. Gideon, he said, take him to the terminal. The terminal. Everyone in that room with any connection to the Valen operation knew what that meant. 3 of Dante's other men were moving before the sentence finished, materializing from their positions around the dining room with the coordinated efficiency of people who had rehearsed for contingencies they'd never been certain would arrive. Lucien's expression changed for the first and only time. Not to fear exactly. To something older and more animal than fear. Something that was fear's stripped-down functional ancestor. The thing that lives in the body before the mind gets involved. He didn't fight it. There was nothing to fight with. His wrist was already damaged, and the men around him were not men who required resistance to justify force. He let himself be walked toward the service exit, and as he went, he said one more thing, turning his head back toward Dante, almost conversational. Read to the end of the ledger, Dante. Read every page. A pause. You're going to need a drink. The service door closed behind him. The restaurant stayed frozen for another 10 seconds. Then Dante turned to the room. All of it, the frozen diners, the shell-shocked staff, the sommelier still pressed against the wall, and said, with a quietness that reached every corner of the space, dinner is on me tonight. Everyone stays, finishes their meal, goes home. A beat. No one saw anything worth mentioning. It was not a request. Everyone understood this. People slowly, carefully returned to their seats. The pianist, after a moment of uncertainty, resumed something that was not quite the same French piece as before, but was close enough. Dante looked at Noelle. She was still standing where she'd been standing when this started, beside the shattered champagne glass and the ruins of what had been a very expensive bottle, and she had not moved because she genuinely wasn't sure if she had permission to move yet, or if her legs would comply if she tried. "Your name," he said. "Noelle Avery." He looked at her for a long moment, not appraising exactly, more like someone trying to see in the features of a stranger the outline of an event they weren't present for, the echo of a room they'd never entered. "She talked to you for an hour and a half?" "Yes." "And you waited 2 years?" "She asked me to." Something moved through his face that he didn't bother to control this time. It was brief, a few seconds, and then it was gone. But she'd seen it, and it was the most human thing she'd witnessed all evening. "Come with me," he said. She stopped. "I have 4 other tables." He looked at her. She looked at him. The absurdity of the sentence existed in the air between them for a moment. "Carla," he said, without raising his voice. The floor manager appeared from the middle distance with the speed of someone who had been hovering just outside the frame of this entire situation. "Mr. Vallon, Ms. Avery is finished for the evening. Her tables will be covered. She'll receive full shift pay plus gratuity." He paused. "From my account." Carla nodded once and was gone. Dante picked up the ledger from the table, held it with both hands for a moment, looking at the cover, the water staining at the corners, the worn spine. Then he tucked it under his arm. "My car is outside," he said to Noelle. "You have a choice. You can stay here, go home, pretend tonight didn't happen." He met her eyes. "Or you can come and finish telling me what she said." Noelle thought about her apartment, thought about the sound 3 months ago of someone moving through it in the dark, drawers opening and closing, the specific creak of the floorboard outside her bedroom that had woken her at 2 a.m. Thought about how she'd spent 3 months sleeping with the ledger and the necklace in a bag under the bathroom sink because it was the one room with a lock that actually functioned. Thought about the minimum payment due on the 16th. Thought about a woman bleeding out in a booth at 4:17 in the morning saying, "Tell him I tried to come back." "I'll come," she said. They moved through the restaurant toward the front entrance, Dante, Noelle, and the 2 remaining men who'd stayed close throughout everything. The other diners watched with the focused non-watching of people performing normalcy under significant strain. As they passed table 6, the woman sitting there, mid-50s, pearl earrings, the kind of woman who lunched and spoke on boards and did not startle easily, caught Noelle's eye for just a second. The look she gave her was not sympathy exactly. It was something more specific. Recognition. The look of someone who has been in a room where history was being made and knew it, and understood that there was no correct response to that. They went through the front door into the Chicago cold. The Escalade was there. Gideon had preceded them with Lucien in a separate vehicle, already gone. A second vehicle idled behind the first. Dante opened the rear door of the Escalade himself and gestured. Noelle got in. The leather seat was warm. Someone had run the heat. The door closed and the city sounds disappeared, and there was just the low idle of the engine and the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on the inside of the car. Dante got in beside her, pulled the door shut, sat for a moment with the ledger in his lap, not opening it, not speaking. Then he said to read to the end. "I know." Noelle had read the ledger, had read every page 3 years ago, 2 years ago, she corrected herself, in the kitchen of her apartment with the doors locked, and her hands shaking so badly that she'd had to set it down twice. "I've read it." He looked at her. "All of it?" "Yes." "Then you know what's at the end." She met his eyes, held them, said the only true thing. "There's a name. Someone else. Not just Lucien." In the front seat, the driver kept his eyes forward and pretended not to exist, which was the only professional response available to him. Dante opened the ledger to the last page. The bottom of it was dark brown and stiff where the blood had dried into the paper, and Serena's handwriting changed in the final paragraph. Still legible, still precise, but slower. The letters formed with more effort, The pen pressed harder as if to compensate for failing strength. Dante read it. Noel watched his face while he read and saw, for the second time that evening, the thing moving through him that he couldn't control and didn't try to. But this time it wasn't grief. This time it was something older and more dangerous, something that belonged to a different category of human experience. The specific, irreversible moment when a man understands that the loss he has been mourning wasn't loss at all. It was a murder, planned, paid for, signed off on by someone with enough power to make the investigation go away before it started. He closed the ledger. He did not look at Noel. He looked straight forward, past the driver, through the windshield, at the Chicago street where the October wind was pushing dead leaves across the pavement. "Commissioner Pierce," he said. Flat, empty. The voice of someone who has just walked through a door and found out the room on the other side contains everything they were most afraid of. Noel said nothing. There was nothing to say. The name was already in the car. The name was already irreversible. The driver, responding to some signal Noel hadn't seen Dante give, put the Escalade in gear and pulled into traffic. And in the space between one traffic light and the next, something in Dante Vallon closed. Not the wounded part, not the grieving part, but the last remaining piece of the man who had been willing to leave certain stones unturned. The man who had buried the questions along with his wife because the alternative was burning down everything he'd built to find answers that might not exist. That man was done. What was left knew exactly what it was going to do, and the knowledge of it sat in the car like a third passenger, patient, cold, and completely without mercy. The Vellon estate sat behind 3 inches of reinforced gate and 12 acres of landscaped darkness on the North Shore, the kind of property that didn't appear on real estate listings because it had never been for sale and never would be. Noel had never seen anything like it, and she had also, somewhere in the rational part of her brain that was still functioning, stopped being surprised by anything that was happening tonight, which was itself a kind of psychological damage she'd deal with later. They pulled through the gate at 11:43. She knew the time because she'd looked at her phone in the car and found 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, which she'd shown to Dante, who'd looked at it without expression and said, "Don't answer that," in a tone that made answering it seem like the least appealing option she'd ever been presented with. Inside the estate was what money looked like when it stopped trying to impress anyone. High ceilings, dark wood, art on the walls that was good enough that she couldn't tell if it was the kind of good that meant millions or the kind of good that just meant someone had real taste. No clutter, no softness. The house of a man who had stopped making accommodations for comfort somewhere around the same time he'd stopped making accommodations for grief. Dante took her to his private study on the 2nd floor. It was the only room in the house, she'd learn later, that still had her in it. Not literally, but in the way that certain spaces hold the shape of the people who occupied them. A book on the shelf with a ribbon bookmark still in place. A small ceramic dish on the corner of the desk that held paper clips and a dried flower that had been there long enough to lose its color. A framed photograph turned face down that Dante's eyes went to immediately when they entered and then moved away from with the practiced efficiency of someone who had trained himself not to look. He set the ledger on the desk. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon from a cut crystal decanter, set one in front of Noel without asking, kept one for himself and didn't drink it. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Everything she said. In order. Take your time." So Noel talked. It took 40 minutes. She went through all of it. The storm, the blood trail, the first aid kit, the hour and a half in the booth. She told him Serena's exact words where she could remember them, and paraphrased honestly where she couldn't and flagged the difference every time. She told him about the ledger, about the necklace, about the instruction to wait 2 years and appear at the Eclipse Room on October 14th. Dante listened without interrupting. He stood at the window for most of it with his back to her and his hands clasped behind him, looking out at the dark grounds where security lights made yellow pools in the October grass. He was still. Not the dangerous stillness from the restaurant, something different. The stillness of a man absorbing impact from a direction he hadn't been able to protect. When she finished, he stood at the window for another long moment. Then he turned around and sat down across from her at the desk, picked up the ledger, opened it to the last page again, to the final paragraph in Serena's slowing handwriting, to the name at the bottom. Commissioner Malcolm Pierce. "How well do you know financial documents?" he said. The question surprised her enough that she answered honestly. Pretty well. My father was an accountant before he got sick. I grew up reading balance sheets the way some kids read comics. She paused. It's why I noticed the inconsistencies in the middle section of the ledger. The routing numbers don't match the account names on 3 of the transfers. It's subtle. You'd need to know what you're looking for. Dante looked at her. It was the third time he'd done that particular look. The one that was trying to see something in her face that had to do with Serena and not with her specifically, and she'd stopped taking it personally. She chose well, he said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was a man acknowledging the precision of a dead woman's judgment with the specific ache of someone who had always known she was smarter than the situation she'd been put in. He pulled out his phone, called a number. It answered on the first ring, which told Noelle something about what time it was and what that meant about who was waiting on the other end. Get me everything you have on Pierce. A pause. No, tonight, right now. Another pause, shorter. I don't care. Wake them up. He hung up. Looked at the bourbon glass he still hadn't touched. Picked it up, set it down again. You've been carrying this for 2 years, he said. Not a question. Yes. Alone? Yes. Someone searched your apartment. 3 months ago, maybe 4. I came home and things had been moved. Nothing taken. I think they didn't find what they were looking for. They were looking for the ledger. I know. He was quiet for a moment. You could have run. Noelle thought about that. Had thought about it, actually, approximately 1,000 times over the past 2 years, particularly on the nights when she woke at 2 a.m. to sounds that turned out to be the building settling, but her nervous system treated as confirmation of every worst case. I told her I'd wait, she said. I wasn't going to break that. Something shifted in his face. Not the wound this time. Something quieter and more complicated. The expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of what other people were capable of. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. The expression he'd just had disappeared completely, replaced by something that had no name she could reach for. It was what happened to a face when the floor drops out underneath a person who thought they were standing on solid ground. He set the phone face down on the desk. What? Noelle said. He stood up, walked to the window again, put both hands on the frame and leaned into it slightly, the posture of a man bracing against something structural. Gideon's at the terminal, he said, with Lucienne. Okay. Lucien made a call, before Gideon got the phone away from him. He paused. The pause was the length of a man deciding how much to say to someone he'd known for approximately 3 hours. Pierce knows we have the ledger. The room rearranged itself around that sentence. Noelle felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. The same information, the same space, but something in the fundamental physics of the situation had shifted. What had been a contained problem had just become an open one. What had been manageable had just acquired edges that extended past the reach of the estate walls, past the 12 acres of landscape darkness, past the gate and the security lights, and the 11 men who were positioned around the property right now doing their jobs. How much time do we have? She said. He turned from the window and looked at her, and this look was different from all the others because it contained something she recognized from the diner booth 2 years ago, from the face of a woman bleeding out in a roadside restaurant while she calculated how many moves she had left. It was the look of someone doing live arithmetic on a situation where the numbers were coming up wrong. Enough, he said. Maybe. Then the lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a gradual dimming. Full cut, instantaneous, the kind that meant the main line and the backup had both been hit simultaneously, which required either a catastrophic coincidence or someone who knew exactly where both were located and had planned for both in advance. The study went black. Dante moved. In the dark, she heard him cross the room, heard a drawer open, heard the specific sound of a weapon being removed from a secured location, a sound she'd never heard before tonight and now apparently recognized instinctively. A small tactical flashlight came on, pointed at the floor. Stay in the chair, he said. Don't move until I tell you. He went to the door, opened it. The hallway beyond was dark except for the emergency strips near the floor that had kicked on automatically, casting everything in a low red wash that made the corridor look like something from a fever dream. His phone buzzed on the desk. She could see the screen light up from across the room. She reached for it without thinking about whether she was supposed to, and saw the message from a number saved only as G. 3 vehicles. East Perimeter. They came through the service access. I've got 2 men down. 2 men down. She set the phone back on the desk and became very still in the chair and listened to the house. Distant sounds she couldn't fully interpret. Movement, a door, something that might have been shouting from somewhere below and outside. Then a gunshot, flat and final, from the direction of the east grounds. And then 2 more in rapid succession that echoed differently from different positions, which meant either 2 different shooters or 1 shooter who'd moved fast. Dante reappeared in the doorway. His face in the red emergency light was the most stripped down she'd seen it. All the constructed parts gone, just the operational core running. "Come with me," he said. "Right now. Don't stop." She came with him. They moved through the corridor at a pace just below running, down a back staircase she hadn't seen on the way up, into a part of the house that was service and utility. Concrete floors, exposed pipes, the infrastructure that luxury lived on top of and pretended didn't exist. He pushed through a door into a parking structure beneath the estate, and there were 2 vehicles here, the Escalade they'd come in, and a matte black Range Rover with plates she noticed were different from any vehicle she'd seen outside. He put her in the Range Rover, got in the other side, started it. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere they haven't thought of yet." He put it in reverse, and they came up out of the underground through a ramp she hadn't known was there and emerged onto a service road on the south side of the property, away from the east perimeter where the 3 vehicles had come through. He drove without lights for the first quarter mile, navigating by the ambient glow of the city on the horizon, which she found either impressive or terrifying and couldn't settle on which. His phone rang. He answered on speaker. Gideon's voice, and the texture of it told her before the words did. Tight, controlled, the voice of a man transmitting information from inside a situation that was still active. "They came for Lucien," Gideon said. "I've got him. He's still contained, but they weren't trying to extract him. They were trying to—" A sound in the background, something mechanical and large. "They were trying to make sure he didn't talk. Pierce sent cleaners, Dante. He's cutting the thread." "You're mobile?" "Moving now. Southeast route." "The girl." A pause. Gideon's voice dropped half a register. "Pierce knows about the girl." Dante said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, "How?" "Lucien, before I got the phone." Another pause. "He gave them her name, Dante. Her full name, and her address." Dante's hand tightened on the wheel. Noelle saw it in the edge of the headlight wash from an oncoming car on the main road ahead, the tendons standing up along the back of his hand, the knuckle whitening of a man who has just been handed a consequence he created and cannot undo. She thought about her apartment, the building on Wicker Street with the faulty intercom and the landlord who'd been promising to fix the elevator since March. She thought about her neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, in 4B, who kept odd hours and sometimes knocked to borrow coffee. She thought about what it meant that Pierce now had her name and her address and a reason to use them. "I need 10 minutes at the Archer Street location," Dante said into the phone. "Can you give me 10 minutes?" "I can give you 7. 7. He hung up. Drove in silence for 90 seconds. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Is there anyone at your apartment? Anyone who could be there tonight?" Noelle thought of Mrs. Okafor, who borrowed coffee, who kept odd hours. "Maybe my neighbor. She sometimes—" "Call her, right now. Tell her to go somewhere else tonight. Any reason. Pick one." Noelle pulled out her phone. Her hands were steadier than they had any right to be. She called Mrs. Okafor, who answered on the 4th ring, sounding alert enough that she hadn't been asleep. And Noelle told her there was a gas smell in the building, and the super had called her and was anyone else home. And Mrs. Okafor said she'd go to her daughters and "Thank you for telling me, honey. You be careful," and hung up. "Done," Noelle said. Dante nodded once. They drove. The city reorganized itself around them as they moved deeper into it. The North Shore giving way to mid-city, the residential scale compressing into commercial, the streets narrowing and brightening with the particular light of areas that didn't fully sleep. He turned onto Archer Street and pulled into a parking structure, 3rd level, where a man Noelle hadn't seen before was waiting next to a door marked Private. Maintenance, with a phone in his hand and an expression that had been trained to communicate nothing. The man handed Dante a flat case and a separate phone and said, "Rourke says the federal line is still clean. For now." Dante took both, said for now is enough. They went through this maintenance store into a space that had been something industrial before and had been converted into something functional. Workstations, monitors, a server rack along one wall that was generating more heat than the room's ventilation was quite managing. Two people were working at the stations, neither of whom looked up when Dante entered, which meant they'd been expecting him and had been doing whatever they were doing with focused urgency for some time. The ledger. Dante set it on the central workstation. One of the operators, young woman, dark hair pulled back, glasses that had a small crack in the left lens that she clearly hadn't gotten around to fixing, pulled on cotton gloves and opened it carefully and began photographing each page with a mounted camera above the workstation. Everything, every page, including the damaged ones at the back. I need clean copies and I need them transmittable. 20 minutes, the woman said. 15, she didn't argue. She moved faster. Dante pulled up a chair at a secondary station and opened the second phone, and for the next 14 minutes he made calls that Noelle was partly present for and partly not. She sat in a chair near the server rack and felt the warmth coming off it and tried to organize her nervous system into something that resembled function. She was aware, in an abstract way, that she was in shock. Not the medical kind, not quite. She was upright and coherent, and her hands had mostly stopped shaking. But the part of her brain that normally processed present-tense reality was running about 45 seconds behind events, like a live broadcast with a delay built in. She kept thinking about the photograph on Dante's desk, the one that was face down. She kept thinking about why someone would turn a photograph face down instead of removing it, about what it meant to keep something in the room where you couldn't look at it but also couldn't put it away. "Noelle?" She looked up. Dante was standing in front of her. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there. "I need you to look at something." She stood up, followed him to the central workstation where the operator had finished photographing the ledger and had the pages displayed on a large monitor in sequence. He pulled up the middle section, the financial records, the routing numbers she'd noticed before. "You said 3 transfers. The routing numbers don't match." "Yes." "On pages." She scanned the monitor, oriented herself. 23, 26, and 31. The account names are in Lucien's handwriting, but the routing numbers belong to different institutions than the ones listed. It's like the numbers were written in by someone else after the fact, someone who was documenting the discrepancy, not hiding it. Serena was documenting it. Yes. But look at 31 specifically. Noelle leaned forward. The operator moved slightly to give her a better angle. This routing number, it doesn't go to the Cayman's account. It goes somewhere else. I looked it up 2 years ago. It traces to a domestic account, Chicago-based. Dante looked at the number, then looked at her. "You traced it." I had 2 years in a library card and my father's accounting knowledge, and a very strong motivation to understand what I was holding. She met his eyes. "The account is registered to a trust. The trust's registered agent is a law firm on Michigan Avenue. The law firm..." She paused, because this was the part she'd lived with for 2 years like a stone in her shoe, present every step, impossible to ignore. The law firm has one senior partner who also serves as outside counsel to the city's Office of Public Integrity. The room had gone very quiet except for the server rack. "The oversight body," Dante said, "that investigates police misconduct and government corruption, yes." She straightened up. "Whoever set up that trust has direct access to any investigation before it becomes public. They would know what was coming. They would know when to move, when to pull back, when to make things disappear." Dante turned to his operator. "Cross-reference the Michigan Avenue firm, senior partners. Cross it against Pierce's financial disclosures for the past 10 years. That'll take..." "Start now," she started. He walked away from the workstation toward the far wall and stood with his back to the room for a moment. When he turned around, his face had done the thing again, the restructuring. And this time what came out of it was not the operational calm from the estate or the cold control from the restaurant. This was something she hadn't seen on him yet. Something tired, deeply, structurally tired. The weariness of a man who has just discovered that what he thought was the end of a problem is actually the beginning of a much larger one. "There's someone above Pierce," he said. It was not a question. "I think there has to be." She kept her voice even. The trust was set up 18 months before Serena died. Whoever it is, they weren't reacting to her investigation. They were already in position before she started looking. The operator said quietly and without turning from her screen, "I've got the cross-reference." Dante crossed the room in 5 steps. The name on the screen was not Malcolm Pierce. It was not anyone from Pierce's office, or his known associates, or the network of names that the ledger had laid out in Serena's careful handwriting. It was a name that Dante Vallin recognized from a different context entirely. A name from the legitimate side of things, the side that shook hands at fundraisers and got photographed cutting ribbons, and had a foundation named after him that did work for children's hospitals. A name so far above the architecture of what he'd been dismantling tonight that finding it here was like pulling up a floorboard and discovering the building had no foundation, that what you'd been standing on was suspended over nothing. Senator Arthur Hale. Dante stared at the screen for a very long time. Then he did something Noel had not seen him do once in the entire evening. He sat down, not in the controlled, deliberate way he'd sat in the restaurant, or the purposeful way he'd positioned himself in his study. He sat down the way a person sits down when their legs have made a decision before their brain has finished processing the information. "She knew," he said, quietly, to no one specifically. She'd gotten all the way up to... His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something in his face changed very fast, the exhaustion replaced by something sharper. He answered it. The voice on the other end was not Gideon, was not anyone from his operation. It was a voice she could hear through the phone from 3 feet away. Male, controlled, the measured cadence of a person who was accustomed to speaking and being listened to. "Mr. Vallin," Senator Arthur Hale said, from wherever Senator Arthur Hale was at midnight on a Tuesday. "I understand you've had quite an evening. I think we should talk." Dante said nothing for 4 seconds. When he spoke, his voice was the flattest she'd heard it, emptied of everything, a frequency that carried meaning purely through its absence of affect. "Talk," he said. "Not on the phone, and not tonight. Tonight has become complicated enough. But I want you to understand something before you make any decisions you can't step back from." A pause. Outside somewhere, a siren passed on Archer Street and faded. "I've been watching this situation develop for some time. I know what's in that ledger. I know what Serena found, and I know what it cost her." Another pause. And in this one was something that could have been calculation, or could have been something that was trying to pass itself off as regret. "I also know what Pierce is planning for the next 12 hours. And I am, for reasons I'll explain in person, willing to tell you." Dante stared at the screen on the workstation. Senator Arthur Hale's name, cross-referenced and confirmed, sitting there in clean sans serif type. "Why?" he said. "Because Pierce has decided that loose ends need cutting, and at this point, I am also a loose end. We have a common problem, Mr. Vallin." The voice was steady, precise. The voice of a man who had spent decades being the most dangerous person in any room by never appearing to be dangerous at all. "And I suspect you've just figured out that the enemy of a catastrophic enemy is the closest thing to an ally you're going to find tonight." Dante looked at Noelle. She looked back at him. In the server rack's warmth and the blue light of the monitors and the muffled sound of the city outside, 2 people who had known each other for approximately 4 hours and had between them the total weight of a murdered woman's final instructions stared at each other across a moment that had exactly 2 directions and no third option. Trust a man whose name was at the bottom of the thing that killed Serena, or walk into the next 12 hours with no map at all, against a sitting commissioner who had already sent cleaners and already burned the official record, and already somewhere in this city tonight had people looking for the only living witness to Serena Vallin's last hour alive. Dante put the phone back to his ear. "Where?" he said. The meeting place was a private dining room on the 34th floor of a building in the Loop that didn't have a lobby directory listing for whoever actually owned the top floors. Senator Arthur Hale had given Dante an address, and a floor number, and a 4-digit code for the elevator and nothing else, which meant either the senator was confident enough in his position to not need additional security theater, or he had security that didn't require announcing itself. Dante assumed the second. He left Noelle at the Archer Street location with 2 men he trusted in the specific way you trust people who have demonstrated over years that their self-interest is durably aligned with yours, Not loyalty exactly, but the more reliable thing, which was mutual survival. He told her to stay away from the monitors, stay away from the phones, stay in the interior room with no windows, and he said it in a tone that communicated clearly that these were not suggestions. She said, "What if you don't come back?" He paused at the door with his jacket on and the flat case under his arm containing clean digital copies of every page of Serena's ledger. Looked at her. The question deserved a real answer, not a reassurance, and she was not the kind of person who would be served by reassurance anyway. He understood that about her now, had understood it since the restaurant, the specific quality of her steadiness under pressure that came not from the absence of fear, but from a decision she'd made about what fear was allowed to do to her. "The copies are in the case," he said. "There are 3 additional copies on encrypted drives in the inside pocket of the case. If I'm not back in 2 hours, take 1 drive to the federal building on Dearborn. Ask for Agent Sandra Reyes, Counterintelligence Division. Give her the drive and nothing else. Don't explain anything, just the drive." "And the other 2 drives?" "One to the Tribune, one to the Sun-Times." He held her gaze. At that point, containment becomes impossible and the story takes care of itself. Noelle looked at him for a moment. "She trusted the right person," she said. "Serena, she trusted the right person when she sent me to find you." It hit him somewhere behind the sternum. He absorbed it without showing it, which was the only thing he knew how to do with things that hit like that, and he left before she could see what it cost him to walk through the door. The drive to the Loop took 19 minutes at this hour. Dante sat in the back of a vehicle driven by a man named Felix, who had been with him for 11 years and who drove with the particular efficiency of someone who understood that the quality of his work was measured in the time between point A and point B and nothing else. They did not speak. The city moved past the windows in its nighttime version. Fewer people, faster pace. The streets belonging to the categories of human activity that didn't require daylight. Dante held the case on his lap and looked at his own reflection in the window and tried to run the mathematics of what he was walking into. Senator Arthur Hale, 73 years old, 3 terms in office, ranking member on 2 committees that mattered, an ornamental presence on 4 others. The kind of politician who had survived long enough to become part of the city's geology. Not elected, but embedded. Not chosen by constituents, but maintained by the accumulated weight of what he knew about everyone who might have challenged him. The name at the bottom of the thing that killed Serena, who was also, apparently, now afraid of Pierce. There were 2 possible versions of this meeting. In the first version, Hale was what he'd claimed on the phone. A man who had been complicit in the architecture of what happened to Serena, but who had not sanctioned the murder, who had not known Pierce would go that far, and who now found himself trapped between what he'd enabled and what it had become. In the second version, this meeting was the cleaner that Pierce hadn't managed to send to the estate, just more sophisticated, more tailored, using Dante's own momentum against him. He did not know which version was true. He was going in anyway because the alternative was spending the next 12 hours trying to build a case against a sitting senator with no access to the institutional channels that building such a case required, while Pierce used those same channels to dismantle everything Dante was trying to construct, and the only living witness to Serena's death sat in a windowless room on Archer Street running out of time. The elevator code worked. He rode up alone, which he'd expected. The doors opened into a corridor with 2 men flanking a set of double doors at the far end. Big men, suited, the subspecies of security that worked for people who could afford the best, and had taken the additional step of actually acquiring it. They did not move to stop him. They did not speak. They simply observed him walk the corridor and open the doors himself, which was either respect or indifference, and the distinction didn't matter. The room beyond was dim. Long table, 12 chairs, all empty except one at the far end. Floor-to-ceiling windows on the north wall showing the city below and the lake beyond it, and the low orange smear of the horizon where the city's light pollution met the sky. Senator Arthur Hale looked smaller in person than he did in photographs. This was common with powerful men. Dante had found the scale they occupied in reality was never sufficient to contain the space they took up in the imagination. He was slight, silver-haired, dressed in a dark suit at midnight with the ease of a man who had never fully stopped working. His hands, resting on the table in front of him, were the oldest thing about him. The hands of a 73-year-old, the one part that didn't perform authority. He gestured to the chair at the near end of the table. The chair farthest from him, 12 feet of mahogany between them, which was the right distance for two men who were not allies and were not enemies and had not yet negotiated what exactly they were. Dante sat down. Did not put the case on the table, kept it in his lap. You look like her, Hale said. Then, at Dante's expression, like someone who's been carrying something too heavy for too long. She looked that way too, the last time I saw her. You saw her. Flat, not a question, a door being held open. 3 weeks before she died. Hale's hands moved slightly on the table, not nervousness, more like a man shifting weight. She came to my office. She had 40 minutes of it already documented. She wanted to know if I would help her build the rest. The room was very quiet. Outside, 34 floors below, the city continued its nocturnal operations. You said no, Dante said. I said I needed time, which was, Hale paused, which was the wrong thing to say to a woman who had already figured out she was running out of it. He looked at his hands. I didn't know Pierce would move that fast. I want you to understand that I didn't. Don't, Dante said. Same word, same register as at the restaurant table with Lucienne. The warning that something was at its limit. Hale stopped, looked at him across the 12 feet of mahogany. Reassessed. Pierce knows you have of the ledger, he said. Different approach. Operational now. He spent the last 2 hours trying to determine how much of it is documented, how many copies exist, and who you've been in contact with since leaving the estate. He has 2 judges in his network who can sign emergency orders, and he has enough reach within the federal field office to delay any clean submission for 48 to 72 hours, long enough to work the problem from his end. What's his move? The girl. Hale's voice was steady and clinical, and Dante registered it as deliberate. The man was stripping emotion out of this because emotion wasn't useful, and he knew it and wanted Dante to know it too. She's the human link. The ledger is evidence, but evidence can be challenged, can be questioned about provenance and chain of custody. A living witness who was present at Serena's death, who can testify to what Serena told her and in what context. He let the sentence complete itself. She's the load-bearing element of any case you try to build. Pierce knows it. His people are looking for her right now. His people have her name and her last known address. Her apartment on Wicker. Hale nodded. They'll have it covered within the hour. When she's not there, they'll start working outward. Your known locations, your associates. A pause. This location will not stay clean past sunrise. Dante put his hands flat on the table, felt the mahogany under his palms. Solid, cold, real. What do you want, Senator? Hale looked at him. I want to survive the next 72 hours. Pierce has decided I'm as much of a liability as you are. I built the architecture he used to cover this up. I know where every piece of it is. He cannot afford to leave me functional. So you come to me. You have the ledger and a witness. I have the institutional knowledge of how Pierce's network is constructed, where the vulnerabilities are, and the specific documentation of 3 transactions that connect him directly to the cover-up that the ledger alone can't establish. He reached into his jacket and produced a single folded document, set it on the table between them, but closer to his side. The route numbers your witness identified. I can tell you whose signature authorized the account they route to. In writing, tonight. Dante looked at the document. And in exchange, he said, in exchange, I want controlled exposure. I want to be the one who comes forward. I want the narrative to reflect that I assisted in bringing Pierce down, not that I was complicit in what led to it. He held Dante's gaze with the steadiness of a man who has spent 50 years looking at difficult people across difficult tables, and has learned that the steadiness itself is a form of leverage. I know what that costs me. I'm not asking for immunity. I'm asking for the ability to make the accounting on my own terms. The silence stretched. Dante looked at him for a long time, long enough that Hale's hands moved once more on the table, the only tell he had. She came to you, Dante said. Serena came to you, and you made her wait 3 weeks. Yes. And in those 3 weeks, Pierce found out she'd been to see you. A pause. That is my belief, yes. So the 3 weeks you made her wait were the 3 weeks in which she ran out of time. Hale said it cleanly, without flinching, which was either genuine accountability or the performance of it, and Dante still couldn't tell the difference, which was the most unsettling thing about this man. Yes, Dante picked up the document from the table. Read it. It was a single page, hand-signed, documenting the specific authorization chain of the account that Noel had traced from the ledger's routing numbers. It named names he recognized from the edges of legitimate power, not criminal names, not syndicate names, the kind of names that appeared on the boards of institutions and in the donor lists of campaigns. The kind of names that meant Pierce's network extended further into the respectable parts of the city than the ledger alone demonstrated. He folded it and put it in the case. "My people will contact your people," he said. "Nothing moves publicly without my sign-off. If anything moves before I authorize it, it won't. If anything moves before I authorize it, the uncontrolled version goes out, all of it, including your name on that trust." Hale nodded once, the nod of a man making a genuine calculation, not a social gesture. Dante stood up. "One more thing." "Yes." "The two judges in Pierce's network. Names," Hale told him. Without hesitating, without negotiating, without attaching a condition, which told Dante something about the specific quality of fear the senator was operating under. When a man of Hale's type gives something without extracting a return, it means the fear is bigger than the calculation. He left the room, rode the elevator down, got back into Felix's vehicle, and sat for a moment in the parking structure under the building with the case on his lap, and the two names in his head, and the document in the case, and the sum total of the last 6 hours sitting on his chest like physical weight. Then he called Gideon. "Status," he said when Gideon picked up. "Lucien is secure. 2 of Pierce's people made a run at the terminal around midnight. We held." A pause. "Martinez is in the hospital, through and through, right shoulder. He'll be okay." "The perimeter? Clean now." "But Dante," Gideon's voice changed register, the specific shift of a man about to deliver information he's been holding, because the moment wasn't right and the moment is now unavoidably right. "Pierce called a presser, 6 a.m. I've got a contact inside his communications team. He's going to announce that the Valen Syndicate is under active federal investigation for the murder of a city official. He's going to name you." The air in the vehicle changed temperature. "What city official?" Dante said, though he already knew, his nervous system already knew, the dread of it spreading from the center of his chest outward before the words could catch up. "Commissioner-designate Raymond Cho," Gideon said. "He was found in his vehicle an hour ago, shot twice. He was going to be confirmed next month. He was Pierce's replacement. Pierce is going to say you killed him to stop the confirmation, to keep the current commission in place." Dante said nothing. "It's a clean frame," Gideon said. "Cho was a reformer. He had public support," the story reads. "And Pierce has the contacts to make the preliminary evidence point your direction before anyone can challenge it. By the time the truth surfaces, you're already in federal custody, and the ledger is suddenly in the custody of the people who want it gone," Dante said. Quiet. The quietness of a man who can hear the architecture of a trap snapping shut around him and is doing, in real time, the mathematics of whether any of the exits he thought he had are still open. 6 a.m. He looked at his phone. 2:47 a.m. 3 hours and 13 minutes before Pierce stood in front of cameras and turned Dante Valen from the man pursuing justice into the man who had killed a reformer to prevent it. 3 hours and 13 minutes before every institutional door that Hale's document and the ledger copies might have opened was instead braced shut by the weight of a federal murder frame. He said to Felix, "Archer Street, now." Felix drove. Dante called the Archer Street location. His man there, Torres, picked up on the second ring. "The girl," Dante said. "She's awake?" "Has been since you left. She's been—" Torres paused. "She's been going through the ledger copies, on the monitor. She keeps looking at something in the middle section. Don't let her leave. I'm 12 minutes out." He hung up and looked out the window at the city moving past, and thought about Serena reading the same numbers in the same ledger in a different context, sitting at whatever table she'd spread her documents across, building her case page by page, carrying the weight of what she knew without being able to put it down, right up until the moment that the weight of it became the thing that killed her. He thought about the photograph on his desk at the estate, face down. He had turned it face down 14 months ago because leaving it upright had begun to function like a wound he was keeping open on purpose, and he'd understood that keeping it open wasn't love, wasn't grief, wasn't even the guilt he'd been using as a substitute for both. It was just damage. Sustained, voluntary damage. And somewhere around month 14 he'd turned it face down, not to stop loving her, but to stop punishing himself for being alive when she wasn't. He had never managed to put the photograph away entirely. He understood now, for the first time with any clarity, why. Felix pulled up to the Archer Street building at 3:01 a.m. Dante went through the maintenance door, up the back stairs, into the workstation room, and found Noelle exactly where Torres had said she'd be, at the central monitor. The ledger copies spread across the screen, one specific page enlarged to fill the display. She turned when he came in. Read his face with the efficiency of someone who'd spent the last 2 hours in escalating dread, and had gotten very good at triage. "How bad?" she said. "Bad." He pulled up a chair beside her. "Show me what you found." She pointed at the screen. "I've been looking at the middle section, the part I told you about, the routing anomalies. But there's something I missed the first time. 2 years ago when I read it, I didn't know enough about how municipal accounts are structured to catch it. Page 26. She traced the number on the screen. "This routing number doesn't go to a private trust. I was wrong about that. It goes to a municipal account. City of Chicago, Department of Internal Oversight." Dante looked at the number. "The Department of Internal Oversight," he said, "is the office that signs off on all official investigations into city officials," Noelle said, "including the investigation into the accident that was supposedly Serena's cause of death." She turned to look at him, and in her face was the specific expression of someone who has just finished a puzzle and found that the completed image is worse than any of the individual pieces suggested. Pierce didn't just cover up what happened to Serena. He ran the cover-up through the department that was supposed to be the check on exactly that kind of corruption. He had access to the internal oversight mechanism itself. Meaning any investigation we trigger through normal channels goes through the same mechanism he controls. Yes. She held his gaze. Unless there's a way around it, something that bypasses the municipal structure entirely. The room was quiet for 3 seconds. Then Dante said, "How fast can you produce a financial analysis? Formal, documented, the kind that can go directly to a federal prosecutorial office without going through the city's internal structure?" She blinked. "Define fast." 3 hours. That's... She stopped. Recalibrated. He watched her do it. The same thing he'd watched her do in the restaurant, in the car, at the estate, absorb the impossible dimension of what was being asked, and then locate, somewhere in herself, the specific resource that could answer it. "I need everything in the case, all the drives, and I need your operator." She nodded toward the young woman with the cracked glasses, who had not gone home, who was still at her station with the focused exhaustion of someone running on coffee and mission. "To pull municipal account records for fiscal years 2021 through 2024. Done, Dante said. He looked at the operator. "Quan, whatever she needs." Quan nodded without looking up from her screen, already moving. Noelle turned back to the monitor, pulled the ledger page larger. Her fingers on the keyboard were steady, her eyes moving across the numbers with an attention that was almost physical, the way her father must have read balance sheets, the genetic transfer of a particular kind of intelligence that expressed itself in patterns other people didn't see. Dante stood behind her and watched the clock in the corner of the monitor and felt, for the first time since the lights went out at the estate, something that was not calculation and not grief and not the cold operational function he'd been running on for the past 4 hours. Something that was closer to the feeling of being in motion with someone, not alone, moving towards something instead of simply away from everything else. 3 hours and 9 minutes until Pierce's press conference. Noelle Avery's fingers didn't stop moving. At 3:45 a.m., Quan said, "I've got the municipal records." And Noelle said, "Pull fiscal year 22 and overlay it with the ledger routing series." And Quan did. And the screen filled with numbers that told a story so clear and so catastrophic that for a moment all three of them simply looked at it. "That's not embezzlement," Quan said quietly. "No," Noelle said. "That's a systematic transfer, over 3 years, structured to look like routine interdepartmental allocations. She pointed at a cluster of transactions in the lower third of the screen. But these aren't allocations, these are payments. And the recipient account, she stopped. Typed something. The screen updated. The recipient account was registered in the name of a private security consulting firm incorporated in Delaware in 2020. The firm's registered agent was a name Dante didn't recognize, but the firm's single documented contract, one contract for an undisclosed security assessment of city infrastructure in fiscal year 22, was signed by a city official whose name Dante did recognize immediately and completely and without any ambiguity at all. Malcolm Pierce's signature, paying a shell company, with public money, routed through the oversight department that was supposed to prevent exactly that. The room held its breath. Then Dante's phone rang. Unknown number. He looked at it for 1 second, then answered. The voice on the other end was not Hale, was not Gideon, was not anyone from any part of his life that he recognized. It was a woman's voice. Official, clipped. The voice of someone calling from a position that didn't make personal calls at 4 a.m. without a very specific reason. Mr. Vallon, she said, my name is Agent Sandra Reyes, Federal Counterintelligence. I received a drive tonight from a source who told me not to ask questions and gave me a number to call if what was on the drive was what she thought it was. A pause, the length of someone in a federal building at 4 a.m. who is holding something that is rewriting the shape of her night. It is. Dante looked at Noelle. Noelle was already looking at him. She had heard the name. Her face was showing something complicated. Not triumph, not relief. The more ambiguous thing that happens when something you've been carrying finally starts to move under its own weight. Mr. Vallon, Agent Reyes said, I need you to tell me where you are right now, and I need you to not move until my team gets there. Because Pierce's press conference is in 2 hours and 10 minutes, and if we don't move first, we're going to lose the window. Dante breathed in, breathed out, felt the weight of what was about to happen. Not the relief of it, not the victory of it, but the irreversible commitment of it, the point after which nothing went back to the shape it had been in. He gave her the address. He hung up. He looked at Noelle, at Quan, at the screen full of numbers that told the truth. Serena had died to document, and felt, in the space between 1 second and the next, in the fluorescent hum of the Archer Street room at 4 a.m, the specific sensation of standing at the edge of something that was either the end of everything or the beginning of the only thing that had ever actually mattered. Then the door at the far end of the room opened. It was Torres. His face was the color of old concrete and his weapon was drawn, and he said 3 words that restructured the entire geometry of the next 5 minutes. They found us. Torres didn't need to say anything more than those 3 words because his face said the rest. The particular compression of a man who has run the calculation in the hallway and doesn't like any of the numbers. Dante was already moving. How many? He said. 4 that I can confirm. Coming up the east stairwell. They've got the main elevator locked from the ground floor. Torres moved to the right side of the door, weapon up, the posture of someone buying seconds rather than minutes. Felix saw them pull into the structure. 3 vehicles. Not police. No markings, no radios I can hear. Pierce's private contractors. Quan. Dante didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Kill the monitors. Everything local, wiped. The uploads are already gone. Went to the federal server 12 minutes ago, Quan said. She was already moving, hands across the keyboard with the mechanical calm of someone who had a contingency protocol and was running it. Reyes has everything. The copies in the case are the only physical... Take the case. Dante turned to Noelle. She was already on her feet, the case in her hand, the specific alertness of someone whose nervous system had been running on threat response for hours and had found a terrible kind of equilibrium in it. He looked at her for 1 second. Just one. Just long enough to communicate what words would take too long to say, which was that she needed to stay functional and close and do exactly what he told her without hesitation. And she looked back and nodded once, and that was enough. There's a window at the end of the west corridor, Torres said. Fire escape. Goes down to the alley. That's where they'll have the 3rd vehicle, Dante said. Not the stairs, not the fire escape. He turned, scanning the room, and his eyes stopped on the door in the far corner that Quan had used twice during the night to access the server rack's external ventilation housing. That door. Building infrastructure, Quan said. Maintenance corridor. It runs the length of the floor and connects to the freight access on the north side. Where does the freight access go? Loading dock, ground level, north alley. Dante looked at Torres. They know this building? They knew the address, the layout. Torres shook his head. 20 minutes maybe. Not enough time to have pulled detailed floor plans. Then we have the corridor. Dante moved to the far door, tried it, unlocked. Beyond it was exactly what Quan had described. A maintenance corridor, narrow, lit by single fluorescent strips bolted to the ceiling every 15 feet. The kind of space that existed in the skeleton of every large building and was used exclusively by people whose job was to keep things running and who were accordingly invisible to everyone whose job was simply to occupy the space. Pipes ran overhead. The floor was concrete. It smelled like dust and electrical heat and the particular staleness of air that moved only when it had to. Quan, Dante said, you go first. You know the building. Move. Quan went. She moved fast for someone who'd been sitting at a workstation for 6 hours, tucked the cracked glasses up into her hair where they'd be out of the way, and went through the door with the focused urgency of a woman who had decided very quickly that she would rather be useful than safe. Noel followed. Dante went last, pulling the door shut behind him. The corridor was 30 feet long and turned left at the end. They moved without talking. Behind them, muffled through 2 doors and a concrete wall, Dante heard the specific percussion of the east stairwell door being forced. The hollow bang of metal hitting metal, then footsteps, then voices too indistinct to parse. They turned left. Another corridor, longer. A T-junction ahead. Quan held up a fist without looking back and they stopped. She cocked her head, listening. From the right branch of the T, from somewhere ahead and below, came the sound of a single set of footsteps. Moving slowly. Careful. Someone who had found the freight access and was working their way up from the loading dock. 1 person coming up. 4 coming from behind. Torres moved past Dante without a word. He took the right branch, his weapon in both hands, and disappeared around the corner into the dark with the deliberate quietness of a man who understood that this was the specific kind of work he was here to do, and who felt, not eagerly but with the bleak professionalism of long practice, entirely prepared to do it. Dante pressed Noelle against the left wall of the corridor, stood in front of her. Not performative, positional, putting his mask between her and the direction the sound was coming from. The footsteps stopped. 10 seconds of absolute silence. Then, from Torres's direction, 2 shots, flat and close and final. And then Torres's voice, low and slightly hoarse, clear. They moved again. The freight access was a wide shaft with a mechanical lift, currently at the ground level, and a set of utility stairs alongside it. They took the stairs down, 3 flights, moving faster now because the clock on the floors above them was running, and everyone in the corridor knew it. At the bottom, a heavy door. Dante pushed through first this time, because the alley beyond was not yet confirmed, and Torres was behind them, and the only thing ahead was whatever had not yet been placed. The north alley was empty. The cold hit them immediately. October at 4:15 in the morning, the wind finding them the way it always found you in Chicago when you were sweating. 3 vehicles were visible at the other end. The south end, Pierce's people. But the north end of the alley opened onto a cross street, and the cross street was empty except for a single black sedan with its engine running and its lights off. That hadn't been there when Felix had parked, and that Dante recognized by the specific damage on the left rear quarter panel as belonging to a man named Ortega, who worked a different shift for a different set of reasons, and whose presence here meant someone had made a call that Dante didn't know about. The sedan's window came down. Ortega said nothing, just looked at them. Dante put Noelle in the back, got in the front. Torres, emerging from the building door 20 seconds later with his jacket torn at the shoulder and a cut across his left forearm that was bleeding with the steady persistence of something that needed attention but wasn't an emergency, got in behind Noelle. Quan went in last, pulling the door shut, and Ortega drove north without being told to. Reyes, Dante said. She's still... Ortega handed him a phone. She's been trying to reach you for 8 minutes. Dante put it to his ear. Reyes picked up before the first ring finished. Where are you? Not a question. The voice of someone managing multiple situations simultaneously and requiring geographic information to continue doing so. North side of the building, Mobile. North on... He looked at the street sign passing. North on Wells. Okay? A pause filled with the background sound of an office running at emergency tempo. Voices, keyboards, a door. We have a problem. Pierce moved the press conference. It's not at 6, it's at 5:30, and it's not at City Hall. It's at the Federal Building. He's trying to get in front of the announcement by making it in a federal venue. He's already got 2 of his people inside. Dante looked at the clock on the dashboard. 4:18. 72 minutes. The data you received, he said, the drive, is authenticated and is currently being reviewed by my supervisor and the duty prosecutor. Reyes's voice was careful here, carrying information precisely. It's enough. On its own, it is enough to support an arrest warrant for Pierce on the financial crimes and the cover-up of Mrs. Vallen's death. But Dante, she used his first name, which told him something about the last 8 minutes, about what she'd seen on the drive and what it had done to her official composure. The murder charge requires the witness, her testimony. Pierce's team is already contesting the ledger's provenance. Without her in front of a judge establishing chain of custody and first-person account, his attorneys can delay the warrant for, how long? 48 hours? Maybe 72. Long enough for the press conference to run. Long enough for the frame to set in public perception before we can counter it. And if she testifies, tonight, Reyes paused. If she can be before a federal judge with jurisdiction tonight, I can have the warrant signed before 5:30, before the press conference. But the judge, another pause. The judge has to be one who isn't in Pierce's network. And right now I am working with a list of 12 names and trying to determine which of them are clean, and I have been doing that for 20 minutes, and I have narrowed it to 3. I have 2 names, Dante said. His network, the 2 judges. Silence. Then, very specifically, tell me. He told her. She was quiet for the length of time it took to cross-reference whatever she was crossing, and then she said, that eliminates 2 of my 3. I have 1 remaining. A beat. Judge Patricia Marsh, Federal Circuit. She's... A sound of movement, a door opening and closing. She's 40 minutes from downtown at this hour. Call her. I'm calling her right now, but Dante, I need the witness physically present. Not a call, not an affidavit, present. There's a federal facility on Michigan, not the main building. A secondary intake. I know it. Can you have her there in 40 minutes? Dante turned to look at Noelle in the back seat. She was holding the case against her chest with both arms, her hair loose from whatever it had been pinned into at the start of the shift that now felt like it had happened in a different calendar year. Her left shoe still on her foot where the blister had been since before any of this started. The sapphire necklace visible at her throat, catching the light of the passing street lamps in that specific deep blue that had stopped the world in a restaurant less than 5 hours ago. She was watching him watch her. She looked exhausted. Genuinely, structurally exhausted, the kind that gets into the bones and requires more than sleep to address. She looked like someone who had been holding something upright through sheer force of will for 2 years and was only now beginning to understand what putting it down was going to cost her. She also looked entirely ready. Yes, Dante said into the phone. They made it in 37 minutes. The secondary federal intake facility on Michigan was not the kind of building that appeared in civic photographs. No architecture, no statement, just function in concrete and security glass. The necessary infrastructure of a system that required places to do things that didn't need to be seen. Agent Reyes met them at the entrance. She was younger than her voice suggested. Early 40s, dark coat, the specific kind of tired that meant she'd been working since before Dante's evening started and had about 4 more hours left in her before the body started billing for it. She looked at Noelle. Ms. Avery. Yes, Judge Marsh is inside. She's been briefed on the evidentiary basis. What I need from you in the next... Reyes checked her watch. 22 minutes is a sworn statement of everything you witnessed on the night of October 14th, 2 years ago. Your presence at the diner, the condition of the victim, the statements made to you, the transfer of the ledger and the necklace, and the instructions given. She met Noelle's eyes with the directness of someone who had no time for anything other than directness. Can you do that? Noelle said, yes. in the same tone she'd used in the diner booth 2 years ago when a dying woman had asked her something just as large and just as irreversible. She went inside with Reyes. Dante stayed on the sidewalk. He stood in the October cold with Torres beside him and the case in his hand and the city around him in its 4:30 in the morning configuration. Quieter than human, not quite empty. The particular between state of a place that was always running but sometimes ran more softly than others. He looked up at the sky where there were no stars because there never were above Chicago, just the city's own light thrown back from the cloud cover. The orange-gray ceiling of a place too busy to go fully dark. He thought about Serena sitting across from a stranger in a diner booth, bleeding, choosing what to say with the time she had left. He thought about the quality of decision that required. Not bravery exactly, bravery being a thing you feel in the moment, a surge of something that carries you past the fear. What Serena had done in that booth was different. It was bravery that had been thought through in advance, planned for. She had known she might not make it back to him, had prepared for that outcome with the same precision she brought to everything, had chosen a stranger carefully and trusted her completely, and sent her forward with everything needed to do the job. He thought about what it cost to love someone like that, to love them with that much strategic care, that much forethought, that much willingness to be the architect of your own memorial. He thought about the photograph on his desk, face down. He thought maybe it was time to turn it back over. At 5:21 a.m., 9 minutes before Pierce's press conference was scheduled to begin, Agent Reyes came through the facility door with a document in her hand and a look on her face that was the professional equivalent of exhaling after a very long time without air. "Signed," she said. "Arrest warrant for Commissioner Malcolm Pierce. Financial corruption, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, in connection with the death of Serena Vallon." She looked at Dante. "My team picked him up 4 minutes ago. He was already in the car on his way to the federal building." A pause. "He didn't say anything when we took him, just looked straight ahead." Dante said nothing. "Lucien Graves is being transferred from your—" Reyes paused on the next word, choosing it carefully. "Your facility to federal custody within the hour. We'll need access." "You'll have it, Senator Hale." She looked at the document in her hand rather than at him. "His cooperation agreement is being negotiated as of 20 minutes ago. He'll face consequences. Not proportionate ones, probably. That's above my pay grade." She looked up. "But the network he helped build is going to be mapped completely. Every routing number, every shell account, every signature, the full extent of it." She paused again. "Your wife documented it very completely, Mr. Vallon. What she built, with the time she had, it was extraordinary work." Dante looked at the facility door. Noelle came through it 2 minutes later, still in her work uniform from the shift that had started what felt like a different lifetime ago. Still carrying the case, the blister shoe, the sapphire at her throat. She stopped in front of Dante on the Michigan Avenue sidewalk, with the sky beginning, very faintly, to differentiate itself from pure black into the very darkest possible gray at the eastern edge. The first geological suggestion that morning existed somewhere in the planet's rotation and would eventually, in its own time, arrive. "It's done?" she said. "It's done," he said. She breathed out. It was a long, controlled exhale, the kind of breath a person holds for so long that releasing it takes actual effort. Her shoulders dropped by half an inch. Her hands on the case loosened. She looked at the necklace, not touching it, just aware of it, the way you're aware of something that's been against your skin for so long it's become part of the landscape of your body. "What happens now?" "Now we go somewhere warm," Dante said, "and we wait for it to finish arriving." They went to a diner. Not the one on Route 41. That was too far, and also neither of them was ready for what that particular geography would cost them. An all-night place on the near north side that had been open since 1960-something and still had the booths in the original vinyl and made coffee the way coffee was made before anyone decided it needed to be an experience rather than a function. They sat across from each other in a corner booth, left wall, where you could watch the room without being watched, which Dante chose without thinking about it, and then caught himself and understood why, and sat down in it anyway. Torres sat 2 booths down. Ortega was outside in the vehicle. Gideon called at 5:47 to say that Lucien had been transferred and the terminal was clear, and Martinez was out of surgery and was going to be fine. Dante said good and hung up, and put the phone on the table and looked at his coffee. She liked diners, he said. Not explaining, not elaborating, just saying a true thing. Noelle wrapped both hands around her mug. I know, she told me. She said, Noelle paused, the care of someone handling someone else's private memory. She said the food didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. She said she respected that in a place. Dante almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. The face muscles moved in that direction but didn't fully commit, which was closer than he'd gotten in a long time. That sounds like her. They sat in the specific quiet of two people who have been through something large together and are still in the process of understanding what it changed in them. Outside, the sky was doing its slow work, the gray deepening into something that contained the suggestion of color at the far eastern edge. The city was beginning to remember it was a city. The debt, Dante said. Your father's medical debt. Noelle looked at him. I'll have it addressed, he said. Not grandiose, not generous sounding, just practical. The tone of a man identifying something that needs to be corrected and intending to correct it. You don't... She asked you to carry this for 2 years, he said, alone. You did it. The least I can do is remove the reason you were working a late shift on October 14th. He met her eyes. Let me. She looked at him for a moment with the measuring look she had, the one that was neither suspicious nor credulous, but something more careful than either. Then she said, okay, in a voice that was trying not to show how much the word cost her to say, how much it cost someone who had been surviving alone for years to accept the weight coming off. What will you do now? She asked. With the syndicate. He looked at his coffee. What Serena was trying to get me to do before all of this, what she'd been saying for 3 years before she died, that I wasn't ready to hear. He was quiet for a moment. She used to say that I'd built something that could either become its own worst enemy or the most disciplined private operation in the city, that the same infrastructure that ran the criminal side could run legitimate enterprises if the will was there. But he paused. I wasn't willing to change what was working. She was telling me that working wasn't the same as right. She was right, Noelle said. Yes. Simple. No argument, no qualification. She was usually right. Outside, the first pale suggestion of actual light appeared at the edge of the sky. 6 weeks later, Commissioner Malcolm Pierce was formally indicted on 9 counts by a federal grand jury. The indictment was unsealed on a Tuesday morning, and the list of counts ran to 43 pages that detailed, with the particular mercilessness of documented fact, how a man entrusted with the integrity of the city's law enforcement apparatus had instead used it as personal infrastructure for graft, obstruction, and the systematic concealment of a murder. Pierce said nothing at his arraignment. Looked straight ahead, as Reyes had said. The look of a man who had prepared, somewhere in the back of his mind, for the possibility that the structure he'd built might not hold forever. Who had perhaps known, on some level, that what he had buried 2 years ago on a coastal highway had not actually stayed buried. That the ledger existed. That the witness existed, that something he had done to a woman who had simply found out too much had sent, with her last coherent act, a chain of consequence forward into time that arrived on a Tuesday morning in a federal courtroom. Lucian Graves cooperated with federal prosecutors in exchange for a modified arrangement that nonetheless guaranteed him the next 12 years in a federal facility. His cooperation mapped the financial architecture of what he and Pierce had built with the completeness of someone who understood that partial cooperation was no cooperation at all. The rival syndicates he had funded with stolen money, the organizations that had received weapons and capital through the shell company network, were identified, and the information was shared with federal law enforcement in 6 jurisdictions. Senator Arthur Hale resigned from office on a Wednesday and submitted to a cooperation agreement the same day. His name appeared in the indictment as an unindicted co-conspirator, which was a legal category that the press translated for the public as guilty but useful. He gave a brief statement on the steps of his Chicago office that contained the words responsibility and reckoning, and that managed, in the particular way of men who had spent 50 years crafting public language, to acknowledge everything while somehow still sounding like a man in control of his own narrative. What the statement did not contain, because no statement he could have given would have been able to contain it, Was anything adequate to the fact of Serena Valen bleeding out in a diner booth while he was making her wait for a meeting he should have taken 3 weeks earlier? There was no adequate language for that. Dante had made peace with the fact that there wouldn't be. Gideon managed the transition of the syndicate's operations with the focused competence of a man who had been waiting for this particular assignment for longer than he would have said out loud. Illegal operations were dismantled in sequence, not dramatically, not publicly, but with the quiet efficiency of a structure being responsibly deconstructed rather than explosively destroyed. The legitimate businesses that had always existed alongside the other activities expanded into the space the dismantling left, and they expanded in ways that required actual management, actual skill, actual attention. The fear that had been the organization's primary operating tool was replaced by something that required more maintenance and was less immediately effective, but that didn't generate federal investigations and didn't get people killed. It was harder work. Dante had expected that. He found, to his own surprise, that the difficulty suited him better. Noelle did not go back to waiting tables. This was not a decision she made dramatically or all at once. It was simply that there was other work to do, work that fit the specific shape of what she was actually capable of, and the other work was there, and she did it. She spent the first month after the indictment working with the federal prosecutor's financial analysis team, going through the shell company network with the same patient attention she'd brought to Serena's ledger in the Archer Street workroom, and finding in the doing of it that the capacity she'd inherited from her father for this particular kind of pattern recognition was not incidental but foundational. It was the thing she was most herself when doing. The medical debt resolved. She didn't watch it happen. Dante had it handled through channels she never needed to see, and one morning she checked the balance and it was zero, and she sat with that for a while. The zero felt strange. She'd been carrying the weight of it for so long that its absence registered as a kind of phantom weight, the sensation of a thing that was still there even after it was gone. She let herself feel it, and then she let it pass, and she went back to the work on her desk, which was real and present and required her attention. She and Dante worked in the same building 3 days of every week. This had not been planned. It had emerged from the overlap of what needed doing and who could do it. The practical geography of two people whose capabilities had turned out to be complementary in ways that neither of them had anticipated on an October 14th in a restaurant that now felt very far away. They didn't discuss it. They just continued arriving at the same building and working on adjacent problems, and sometimes, when the work ran long, eating dinner in the same room. On the 6-month anniversary of the indictment, Dante asked her to come with him somewhere. She said yes. The Velen Mausoleum was in a private cemetery on the north side of the city, a place that had been established by old money and maintained by the kind of institutional care that came with endowments and permanent staff. It was quiet in the way that places designed for quiet are, not peaceful exactly, but composed, the landscape holding itself in a specific arrangement that discouraged disruption. The late afternoon light on the October marble was gold, not metaphorically, actually gold. The low-angle light of a sun in its October position hitting white marble and coming back warm, the way certain stones hold light rather than simply reflecting it. Dante had brought lilies. White ones, the specific variety Serena had preferred, which he knew because he had paid attention to the things she preferred and had continued paying attention even after there was no longer a practical reason to. He set them at the base of the stone. He stood there for a while. Noelle stood slightly behind him and to the left, which was the right distance, close enough to be present, far enough to give him the space the moment required. She had been doing that all along, she understood now, maintaining the right distance. The specific skill of being with someone without crowding the things that needed room. He turned to look at her, at the necklace at her throat, the sapphire, still there, where it had been since she'd put it on 2 years ago in accordance with a dead woman's instructions and had not removed it since, even after the instructions had been fulfilled, because removing it hadn't felt right, and she'd learned to trust what felt right, even when she couldn't explain the reasoning. Dante reached out, gently, his hands moving to the clasp at the back of her neck, with the care of someone handling something that had belonged to the most important person in his life. She gave this to protect your life, he said. It belongs to her story. She felt the clasp release, felt the slight absence of weight as he lifted it away. He held it for a moment in his palm. The sapphire catching the gold light, throwing it back in that particular deep blue that she would always associate with the specific moment a man's hand closed around a waitress's collar in a restaurant and the world reorganized itself. He set it carefully against the white marble of the stone, where it would stay. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small velvet box. Opened it. The pendant inside was a diamond. Not large, not ostentatious. The opposite, actually. Simple setting, clear stone. The kind of thing that derived its quality from what it was, rather than how it announced itself. New. Untouched by anything that had come before. He fastened it around her neck. She felt the weight of it settle. "This belongs to yours," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Around them, the gold light was moving slowly across the marble, and the lilies were white against the stone, and the city was visible at the edge of the cemetery's landscaping, still running, still loud, still entirely itself. She thought about the woman who had sat across from her in a diner booth at 4:17 in the morning and chosen her with great care and trusted her with something irreplaceable and asked her to carry it forward. She thought about what it meant to have been chosen for that. Not luck. She'd stopped calling it luck a long time ago. Something more deliberate. The specific reach of a woman who understood, even dying, that what she was setting in motion was larger than the moment she was in. Noelle touched the diamond at her throat, felt the cool of the stone warming against her skin. "Thank you," she said. Not for the necklace. He understood that. She saw in his face that he understood. They stood at the grave for another few minutes, not speaking, letting the gold light do what October light does. Arriving slowly, staying briefly, changing everything it touches in the time it has. Then they walked away together, through the cemetery's composed quiet, toward the gate and the city beyond it, which was loud and cold and ongoing and entirely indifferent to the specific weight of what two people were carrying as they walked through it, which was not grief and was not triumph, but was something that contained both and was larger than either. Behind them, on the white marble, the sapphire caught the last of the gold light and held it. The way certain stones do. The way certain women do. The kind that don't let go of what they're given, even after they're gone.